Part 3, and I touched on this again at the beginning, Part 3 is about the UK story, and the story, the headline here is very much that there is nothing to be afraid of, that you can cut your emissions and you shouldn't expect that the sky is going to fall in, or that you have to make huge sacrifices in lots of other places. It will be very difficult. It needs a huge political and policy-making effort to get there, but it doesn't mean you need to sacrifice lots of other things. I showed you this already. This is the obvious headline of that. GDP has been rising in the UK while emissions have been falling. Interesting thing to look at is, well, when we project forward, how has our expectation of costs changed? We've been talking about the zero carbon target, the 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We think that will cost around 1 to 2% of GDP. That is set on a pretty conservative basis in terms of progress with technology development. So we've assumed that the progress we've seen in wind costs, in battery costs, we assume that that's baked in, that continues to be the place in future. We don't assume they get more expensive in future. But we don't assume that really strong innovation story in renewables and in batteries occurs in other sectors. So we haven't assumed that we have that again. What's really interesting is if we look at the cost that we used to think an 80% target would be, it was also 1 to 2% of GDP. When we did this estimate in 2008, we thought it would be about 1 to 2%. And this is about the cost of things coming down once you set a target. Does anyone want to guess what we used to think a 60% CO2 target would cost? You're wrong, it's not 1 to 2. It was 0.5 to 2% of GDP. So this is back in 2003, an energy white paper. And it just, again, once we've set targets, businesses deliver against them and they get better at it. And once we do things, we get better at them. So we've had this story where as you set a target, actually it turns out not to be as hard as you thought it could be. And you can increase your effort without increasing costs. I don't think anyone in the Climate Committee in the UK would be surprised at all if it turned out that in 2050 we were better off as a result of having pursued these things. We are seeing electric cars now, which looked very expensive when we started talking in 2008 about these. You know, Teslas weren't really there at that point. We started talking about this in 2003. It looked really expensive. But now, actually, we think within a decade it will be cheaper to buy, cheaper to run an electric car, even when you bake in all the costs of the infrastructure, even when you allow for the different tax treatments. So this is a real story of kind of innovation once we set targets. More effort at the same cost. And even if you don't think that that cost will come down, loads of other good reasons to do this. These costs do not include any of the co-benefits, so the better air quality that you get, the better ecosystem services that you can get with the shifts in land that we've talked about, the potential to have clean growth, because this is a global market, right? This is a trillions and trillions of dollars market in terms of low carbon goods and services. If New Zealand invents a vaccine to allow cows to be reared without methane, that is a huge global opportunity, right, to then sell that around the world. More prosaically in the UK, you know, we manufacture cars. The future for manufacturing cars is not to manufacture petrol and diesel cars, it is to manufacture electric cars. If you don't make the shift, then you risk your industry being left behind and having bigger problems. And again, there's nothing in here to assume that innovation follows from setting the target. In reality, it almost certainly does. This is complicated, so I won't dwell on the numbers in here, but this is about what's happened to energy bills in the UK. It's in hundreds of pounds a year. They're about 1,000. They went up from 2004 until when the UK Act was passed in 2008. But actually they went up because of increases in gas prices, basically, for the UK. We spent a bit more on low carbon policy, but we more than compensated for that with energy efficiency. And then if we go from 2008 to when we did this analysis, so 2016 bill, energy bills actually came down even though gas prices went up, because we put more focus on energy efficiency and we really drove down the amount of energy that was being used. And so that has enabled us that at a time when we've increased the spend on renewable generation here by about 10 billion quid a year. We're spending a huge amount on offshore wind, which was really expensive at this point. We now expect it not to be more expensive in future. We expect it to be as cheap as gas in the future, but it was bloody expensive in this period. But even with that, energy bills came down because we had a good energy efficiency program alongside it. And that is about standards, it's about obligations on suppliers. So it's not been driven by a carbon price, it's been driven by regulation and standards. And you can tell a similar story across other bits, right? Across other objectives. People worried the lights are going to go out if we have all these renewables. That hasn't happened. People worried that the industry was going to be pushed offshore, and the reality is that some industry has closed in the UK, but not because of climate policy, because actually the policies we have not added costs to industry. They've been designed in a way that didn't add costs. Very important to get the policy design right there. This is a genuine issue that we should be genuinely concerned about, but it doesn't mean that you can't act. It just means you have to get the policy design right. Fiscal circumstances, there are more challenges in the UK in managing the UK fiscal situation than come from this area. I mentioned some of the co-benefits. And then a really important thing I want to share with you is just about policy. I said that the real difficult thing is policy. And the quote at the top here is from Nick Stern. If you believe in markets, you have to believe in market failures. He did The Economics of Climate Change. It was a UK Treasury publication back in 2006. It really built the base for the Climate Committee in the UK. And the market failures go well beyond a carbon price. So carbon price is very important, and you can have lots of different forms of the carbon price. We have a few in the UK. But the market failures go well beyond that. You have to deal with barriers to activity. And that, again, standards are a key thing there. Product standards have made a big difference across Europe, not just in the UK. Efficiency standards for cars have not been as effective as they ought to have been, but still helpful. Helpful, again, not just in terms of cutting carbon emissions, but in terms of cutting costs for motorists, in terms of cutting costs for homeowners. And then things around landlords, but also then the long-term stuff. There's an innovation market failure, right? Things we need to do for 2050 are not things that the market will naturally start doing unless government intervenes to make sure they do it. The big story in the UK there was about renewable support. The government put a lot of money into offshore wind. It did it in a well-designed way, and what we've seen then is that offshore wind is now a serious low-cost option that the UK can deploy at scale. It's also an option that then is helpful in other jurisdictions as well. I won't dwell on progress. We talked a bit about the power sector already, but the big story in the UK actually is the red line here is our emissions from the power sector, and it shows you how quickly you can make a change once you focus on it, once you get the right policy designs in place. But you can also see on here we haven't had universal success by any means. We've got some big challenges we still need to sort out. Transport stands out there as a real challenge for us. But again, the progress we have made there is about getting the foundations in place. So having lots of different electric vehicle models brought to the market, having an infrastructure for electric vehicle rollout, which will positions us to do better in future than we have today. This is just an example of one of the responses from the government to the Climate Committee's recommendations. This was their plan to deliver the 5th carbon budget covering 2030. It was endorsed by the Prime Minister, which is the right level of endorsement. These plans have to cut across the economy. They need ownership at the centre of government. It has a lot of policies in it, a lot of proposals as well, but it still isn't actually enough. It's a good foundation again, but we are going to need more in the UK. The other thing I just want to mention is there was a rebranding that happened in here. The expectation was that this would be called an emissions reduction plan. In the end, it was called a clean growth strategy, and it was published very much as part of and alongside the UK's industrial strategy. So really kind of joining up that idea that the future for a lot of the UK industries is a low carbon future, and our climate strategy in terms of reducing emissions should be aligned to that and reflect it. And that was a pretty important branding move, right? Narrative is important here in terms of bringing the players with you. Even though some of the policies in here don't do as much as we would like, that step to kind of embrace a clean growth philosophy was a hugely important one. I slightly mentioned this, but the power sector is our best example of effective policy in the UK, and the key components of it were essentially these. We had a very clear objective for where we were trying to get to for about a decade out. We had a good design of policy in order to get there. That was about baking in competition within that target. So we had a target that was clear about getting to a certain level of renewable penetration. We then had competition through auctioning for developers to provide renewable energy. And they were competing for contracts that were well designed for them. So we didn't have just an hourly price in a market that goes up and down with a gas price and under carbon price, we had a 15-year contract that said, well, look, your costs are up front, so the return you need needs to be long-term. And those were the contracts we auctioned. Alongside that, we had other levers, carbon price, which I should say the carbon price in the UK is the equivalent of about 70 New Zealand dollars. Again, that hasn't forced bills through the roof. That was included in the numbers I showed you earlier, but it has driven a shift from coal to gas. And product standards, with no expectation that auctioning renewable power would mean that people improved their energy efficiency. That had to be about targeting the policies to the players, the agents that have control over particular things. And sticking to it, having a commitment that we were going to get there, we would provide the funding consistent with it, and announcing that in advance. So we were announcing back in the early 2010s our funding for this right through to 2020, and announcing the commitment to it. That was signed off very clearly by the Treasury, not just by the Energy Department. So that enabled people to plan and to develop projects that they could then bring to market. And the result of that has been that the price for offshore wind was over £150 a megawatt hour. When we started this, it's now close to £50 a megawatt hour. We've reduced it by 2/3. Okay, then some closing observations that, again, as I said at the beginning, policymakers are key to this. Government has to provide the leadership. The legislative framework should be reducing policy risk and making it clear to players out there of the direction of travel rather than the individual bits. And we need to balance certainty with flexibility. So again, that's to the point. We've discussed this in some of the questions. The Act, the Zero Carbon Bill, sets the overall direction. It doesn't prescribe what you do every single year in every single sector. That can be worked out as you go, and we have to respond to it as we go. CCC has succeeded with analysis and evidence. And then this point I think is a crucial one to emphasise, that effective policy has to tackle the different bits of market failure. You do need a whole package to drive the change that we want. And then the closing thing I want to say is that next year is a very big year for us in the UK. It's a very big year internationally as well. We in the CCC will be producing a new pathway to get to that zero carbon target that we talked about. The government will have to bring forward policies in order to meet it. We will be helping them with that. And then crucially, we want to be in a position where, as the UK, ahead of the UN climate talks at the end of the year that we're aiming to host, that we have a full package that says, right, we have a zero carbon target, we have a pathway that will get us there, we have a set of policies that will deliver that pathway. We are taking climate change seriously, and this is what it looks like, so that then when we're hosting the talks, we can help other countries to see what it looks like for them, that as a world we can get to a point where more countries are doing what they need to do to take it seriously, and that is the only way that we will achieve what we need to do. I think that's the last one. Thank you.